Okay. Reconstruction, high hopes and harsh realities, from 1865 to 1877. Now, the very first thing we're going to look at, Reconstruction went through two different stages. It went through both presidential Reconstruction and congressional Reconstruction. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is presidential Reconstruction. Now, going into this, know that basically it's a new America. There were more than 620,000 lives lost and hundreds of thousands more wounded. The Southern infrastructure and economy was devastated. The passage of the 13th Amendment liberated more than 4 million former slaves. But we're going to have difficulties. How do we know that? Because as Abraham Lincoln said, cannons conquer, but they do not necessarily convert. Meaning, you've got to win the hearts and minds of the South. So how is the Republican Party going to reintegrate back in the formerly rebellious territories? Next slide. Well, what were the Republican war aims? Well, guys, even though the Republican Party had promised to prohibit slavery only in the territories, its war aim at the beginning of the Civil War was merely to reunite the country. By January 1st, 1863, Lincoln felt that it was time and proper to issue the Emancipation Proclamation that freed slaves in conquered territories. Now, it didn't free all the slaves, because up north you still had slavery allowed in like Maryland, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri. But it was a start. Next slide. Well, you start to have the rise of the radical Republicans. And remember, these guys aren't the majority of the Republicans. They're the radicals. People like Frederick Douglass, the escaped slave, who had even written a book. Thaddeus Stevens, a manufacturer who was born with a club foot. And he said this gave him a kind of a outward sign that he was for the downtrodden. And you had like Charles Sumner, that guy who had gotten beat up so severely by Representative Brooks in the years just preceding the Civil War that it took him more than 6 months to recover. Basically, these guys thought that the only way to do this in the South was to basically radically reconstruct the society. Not only free the slaves, but also guarantee them political rights, including the right to vote. Otherwise, their freedom would be for nothing. So what does Lincoln believe? Lincoln's approach is with malice towards none. Let me see if y'all are getting that on the... Well, not really, but we try. We try. Okay. Just 1 month before his death, Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, said, with malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne battle, and for his widow and orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Basically, with the fighting done, Lincoln appointed temporary military governors as soon as he could to get the South back in as quickly as possible. Now, during the war, he had issued the proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, where a state in rebellion could be readmitted when 10% of the population that had voted in 1860 took an oath of allegiance to the Constitution of the United States. Now, some groups were omitted from this offer, but this was known as the lenient 10% plan. And in the next slide, we kind of discuss it a little bit more. Basically, it gave full pardon and restoration, but like I told you, that 10% had to take loyalty to the Union and had to accept the abolition of slavery. After the 10% of the 1860 voters had taken the loyalty oath, they had to write new state constitutions that abolished slavery and elect officials. The only people who weren't allowed to participate in this were high-ranking Confederate officers. Getting ready for the next slide. Now, the radicals thought this was way too easy, way too lenient. I mean, why was Lincoln so easy? Because, guys, we had almost killed ourselves as a nation. And it was time to put down the weapons of war and to become brothers and sisters again. But Benjamin Wade and Edmund Davis thought that that was way too easy, and they came up with the Wade-Davis bill that didn't pass until the very final days of congressional session. Basically, a majority of the male citizens had to declare their allegiance, and only those who took an ironclad oath attesting to their past loyalty could vote. The new states would have to abolish slavery, exclude high-ranking officials of the Confederacy from political rights, and had to pay their debts back. So, guys, this is much more draconian than Lincoln's plan. Well, how did Lincoln respond to this? Well, simple. He didn't sign the bill. And if a president doesn't sign a bill for 14 days after it's been passed, then it's considered a pocket veto, because he knew that they wouldn't get a 2/3 majority to override his veto, because, like I told you, it barely got passed. And through Lincoln's 10% plan, you had states like Arkansas, Louisiana, and Tennessee, all that became states, readmitted to the Union. Ready for the next slide? Now, what were the reality of the new governments? Well, guys, the new governments weren't that great. Some of the states denied voting rights. Like Louisiana said that blacks couldn't vote, who were a quarter or more black. They maintained the restrictions. They would later become known as the Black Codes, restricting the freedoms, trying to keep the South as unchanged as long as possible. While this, of course, infuriated the radical Republicans, Lincoln, however, urged patience. He told them, guys, this is like the fowl is to the egg. And we're going to sooner have the chicken by hatching the egg than by smashing it. Ready for the next slide? All right, states. Early in 1865, state legislatures or conventions had abolished slavery in West Virginia, Maryland, Mississippi, and Tennessee, even though it was still legal in Delaware and Kentucky. Now, to make sure that slavery was abolished, I should have read this before, this is C, abolishing slavery forever, the 13th Amendment. So on January 1st, 1865, the 13th Amendment is ratified, which means it's issued by the national government and put out to the states. So they needed 27 of the 36 states in the Union of America at that time to vote yes and agree to it. And if 3/4 of the states agreed to it, it's added to the Constitution. But by December of 1865, only 19 of the 25 northern states had voted for the 13th Amendment, barely missing that 3/4. If it hadn't been for the yes votes of 8 reconstructed southern states that pushed it beyond the 3/4, the 13th Amendment may not have been passed. Ready for the next slide? Now, Lincoln's assassination. Well, guys, just like with Kennedy, there's tons of conspiracies about Abraham Lincoln and about who was responsible for his death. Some people thought it was bankers because the Confederate States weren't going to pay back their war debts. Other people thought it was the Catholic Church. What do we know? We do know that Lincoln, he had the Civil War, done the whole Reconstruction, getting that off the ground. His friends told him, hey man, you need to go take a break. Why don't you go to Ford's Theater and check out that new comedy, Our American Cousin? So he decided, yeah, I'm going to go do that. Now his bodyguard, John Parker, wasn't in Washington, D.C. He had gone back to be with his brother, who was either really sick or who had broken his arm. I forgot which. But his bodyguard wasn't there, so instead of having a bodyguard, they had a cop. And what do you think the cop was doing during the play? He was watching the play. Next slide. That's when actor John Wilkes, this is Lincoln's assassination continued. That's when John Wilkes Booth sneaks into the presidential box holding a Derringer. Now, he had already tried to get rid of Lincoln back on March 17th, 1865. He tried to kidnap him, but that fell apart. But on April 9th, which was the day of Ford's Theater, he snuck in, shot him in the back of the head, jumped off the presidential box. He got his spur caught in one of the awnings here, so he landed on his foot weird, and he twisted his ankle, but he stood up on stage, shouted out, "Sic semper tyrantus," or "Thus always to tyrants," and he made a break for it out through the back door. And basically there was a manhunt on for him for about 3 weeks. They finally tracked him down to a barn where they even set it on fire to try to get him to come out. He wouldn't come out though until he was half dead, and as he lay dying, his famous words were, "Tell mother I die for my country. I thought I did for the best." Now, what is interesting is, just a few years before, one of Lincoln's boys was playing at the train station, and he had slipped off the platform and he was down near the tracks as the train was coming in, and he couldn't get up to get a hold of the edge of the platform to pull himself up, and this hand reaches down, grabs young Lincoln's hand, pulls him up and puts him on the platform. And the guy who saved Abraham Lincoln's son was Edwin Booth, older brother of John Wilkes Booth. Weird. Anyway, next slide. Now, Lincoln's assassination was part of a larger conspiracy. It says Lincoln's assassination continued. Basically, Booth and 3 others were going to kill the 4 top people in the line of succession from the president to get down to a 5th guy that they thought would be much kinder to the South. Now, George Azardot was the guy who was supposed to kill Vice President Johnson. And he went to the hotel where Johnson was staying, because we used to have our Vice President, he'd have a room in a hotel. And George gets to the hotel, and he's feeling scared. So he goes to the bar, gets himself a drink. He feels he's not brave enough. So he has another, and another, and another, and eventually he passes out drunk. Now, the other 2 guys did wound their targets. They didn't kill them, but they did wound them. Ready for the next one? So, Andrew Johnson and Reconstruction. This is E, Andrew Johnson and Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson was born to a poor family in Tennessee. He hated the wealthy and planter elite. That those were the ones that he blamed for dragging Tennessee as well as the South into the Confederacy. Because if you remember, 2/3 to 3/4 of Southerners did not own slaves. White Southerners did not own slaves. He worked his way up through politics, becoming a senator of Tennessee, and he was the only senator from one of the Confederate states that did not leave his federal job when the South ceded. Because of that, Lincoln put him in as the military governor over Tennessee. And like I told you, they believed that he would be very tough, especially on the wealthy and planter elite, because that's who he thought the true enemy was. Ready for the next slide? And remember, guys, if you think I'm going too fast, you can hit the space bar and stop it, finish writing down your notes, and then go on to the next slide. Andrew Johnson and Reconstruction continued. Well, Andrew Johnson's views on Reconstruction were very similar to Abraham Lincoln's. And he was held by the Constitution. Basically, he was a firm believer in states' rights. Indeed, he thought that the states had never left the Union, so they never were really gone. So therefore, according to Andrew Johnson, Reconstruction was unnecessary. Or so he thought. Ready to go to the next slide? He issues his 1865 Proclamation of Amnesty. And basically in this one, the only people that were excluded from pardon were those that owed property worth more than $20,000. Because it was the wealthy planters, bankers, and merchants that he felt were the despicable ones that caused the Civil War. So the states don't even have to meet the timber cent plans anymore. All they had to do was call constitutional conventions, write a new state constitution, form new governments, and he thought that this was going to be an incredible opportunity for the newly liberated middle class. Now that they've taken out the mean 1%. Now, of course, in these new governments, they appoint some former Confederates. Now, most of these were like low-level Confederates. They weren't the big boys. But it was enough to outrage the radical Republicans. Ready for the next slide? So, G, Southern response, minimal compliance. Johnson's expectations, he thought the new Southern governments would abolish slavery, would ratify the 13th Amendment, they'd hold elections and rejoin the Union. And the new political and economic leaders that would rise up, now that they've been liberated, would come from the middle class. Sad thing is, though, didn't work out that way. What were the realities? A lot of the states rejected black suffrage. They didn't give blacks the right to vote. Indeed, you had some planners and Confederate officials elected to political positions instead of the middle-class common man. Why? Well, a lot of those guys knew if you were a mayor before, you knew how to run a city. If you were a governor before, you knew how to run the state. Then the southern states, they start to feel, because they got in so easy, they start to feel like Johnson was their protector. And they thought that it was going to be up to the states, not Congress, to define the status of the former slaves. You ready? Freedom and the legacy of slavery. Roman numeral 2. Well, guys, first off, remember, freedom wasn't something that Lincoln or the Union armies gave to enslaved blacks. Rather, every time an individual slave stopped working for a master and claimed the right to be free, they were. Following such and the chaos that swept through the South in the final days of the Civil War, many slaves were effectively free. Now, down here in Texas, long after the Civil War had ended, remember here in Texas, this is where the last battle of the Civil War was fought, and the Civil War had already over, and the Confederacy won. But on June 19th, a ship arrives in the port of Galveston with news that not only has the Civil War ended, but that all the slaves are free. So it should come as no surprise that Jubilee, or a party, broke out. And that's why every June 19th, here in Texas, we celebrate Juneteenth. Because that's when news of the ending of slavery arrived. Ready for the next slide? A, creating communities. Excuse me. Well, one of the first things that the newly freed men had to do was form communities. And if any of y'all go to places of worship, you might be familiar with this, churches are a community. So it should come as no surprise that churches did become focal centers of not only spiritual teaching, but also of schools themselves. They had to teach both the kids as well as the adults how to read. Now, there was a huge problem, though. Education, black or white, was not popular in the South. So they needed government assistance. And the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a part of the War Department, was created to help organize and the funding to pay for the schools. It was formed in March of 1865. And they began to work with the churches to establish schools. And by 1870, there were 4,000 schools, supervised with 9,000 teachers and 247,000 students. And you had a student-to-teacher ratio of about 1 to 27. But still, guys, there's only enough room for about 1 out of 10 students that needed to be in school. So it was a little, but it was something. Now also you had creating communities continued. You started to have the growth of like newspapers. First African American newspaper in America was La Union in 1862 down in New Orleans shortly after it was liberated. And by 1865 you had black political conventions that were being formed, that were attended to by like ministers, skilled craftsmen, former soldiers. Might want to change the battery. Okay. So, meanwhile, you have the white South confronting change. Basically, a lot of whites, Southerners, came back from the Civil War, finding a totally changed world. I mean, their wealth was gone, society was rapidly changing, and they felt a bitter hatred towards the North, because the North were the people that they thought was responsible not only for their defeat, but also for forcing all these changes. And a lot of these guys passed like the black codes, which I told you before were those laws that restricted the freedoms of the newly freed men, to try to make it as much as it was like before the Civil War, the antebellum South, as possible. Now, it should come as no surprise that this at times would turn to violence. You had guys like Nathan Bedford Forrest. And if you've seen Forrest Gump, that movie, the character Forrest Gump is named after Nathan Bedford Forrest. Anyway, he came back to Memphis to find his family, which used to have a lot of wealth, now totally destitute. And had no money, everything was gone. And so he wanted to get together with his friends, and they formed a little group called, that he took from the Greek word for circle, Ku Klux, and they called themselves the Ku Klux Klan. And their aim was to regain white supremacy. And here you can see a picture of what these early Ku Klux guys look like, you know, just black uniforms with white pillowcases on their heads, false mustaches and goatees. And basically they fought against both the Republicans as well as tried to scare the newly freed men. Indeed, it got to be so crazy that after just a few years, even Nathan Bedford Forrest got out of the group, because it got a little too crazy. Ready for the next slide? The battle over Reconstruction. Well, a lot of the the radical Republicans and even moderate Republicans weren't so crazy about the way things were going on in the South. So we have A, the question over Reconstruction. Basically, a lot of the southern states passed new regulations which limited the black vote. Johnson wanted the states to invalidate their secession ordinances, abolish slavery, and repudiate or pay back their state debt. And most of the southern states, because they think he's their protector, don't meet all of Johnson's requirements. Like South Carolina and Mississippi, they don't pay off their war debt. And the Mississippi legislature refused to ratify the 13th Amendment. And of course, because Johnson does nothing, basically it inspired one northern reporter to write that in the South there was an utter absence of national feeling and a desire to preserve slavery as much and as long as possible. Not only that, but the South, they started to elect to Congress many ex-Confederate leaders. Like Georgia had elected Alexander H. Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy, to Senate. Also, there were 4 Confederate generals, 8 Confederate cabinet members, and a host of lesser rebels, all had won positions. And basically, when they get up to Washington, D.C., Congress totally denies them seats. Here you see in the political cartoon, that's supposed to be Johnson. That's Confederate States of America. That's on his belt buckle, and that's an Irishman. And they're all trampling on the newly freed man. Ready to go to the next slide? So how do the radicals react to this? Well, this is when you have the moderate Republicans start to drift towards the radical Republicans. Well, what are the radical Republicans thinking? They're thinking, hey, it's not working in the South. We have to totally take over of Reconstruction. You had guys like Thaddeus Stevens who said, hey, they should be treated like conquered provinces. And they have to go, they're basically like unorganized territories. And they have to work their way back. Charles Sumner believed that basically they committed state suicide. And once again, couldn't get back unless Congress put up regulations for them to get in. Basically, they had forfeited their rights. And it was the role of Congress to bring these states back into the Union. You ready? Reaction of the radicals continues. So you have the battle of who's going to be in charge of Reconstruction beginning between the president and Congress. And basically, there was a bill to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau. Johnson vetoed it because basically he believed that because it was a wartime measure, that war was now over, it no longer needed to be in existence. Well, how does Congress react to this? Well, they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which is really important because it's kind of the basis of the 14th Amendment. And we'll talk about that next slide. Johnson, of course, vetoes that, as well as they wrote a revived Freedmen's Bureau bill, and Johnson overrides that. Ready for the next slide? So what was the Civil Rights Act of 1866? Basically, it granted citizenship to the newly freed men. Johnson, I told you, he vetoed it. Congress was able to get together a 2/3 majority and override his veto. Included in this amendment was a due process clause that basically said that the government could not take away a citizen's rights, property, or life without following a due process, a due legal process. Also, states were now subject to the Bill of Rights in our Constitution. And like I told you, this act would later become the 14th Amendment. Ready for the next slide? Even though Tennessee was the first state to vote yes for the 14th Amendment, there were riots that broke out in May and July in Memphis and New Orleans that fueled a lot of anti-Johnson sentiment. Ready to go to the next slide? D, Johnson loses support. Well, he goes out on this speaking tour trying to get more support for his position, which turns into a total fiasco. I mean, you have he thinks he has to answer every heckler, which just leads into shouting matches that go nowhere. Then he also, also at one stop, they had him Cleveland. He took a dramatic pause, and the engineer thought, oh, well, he must be done with his speech. So he goes ahead and he starts leaving the station in the middle of Johnson's speech. And by the midterm elections of 1866, basically the Republicans win a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress. So basically they can override any presidential veto. They're going to be the big dogs now. Ready for the next slide? 4, reconstructing the South. A, congressional reconstruction. Well, Congress moved to protect its program from President Johnson by passing 3 different acts over the president's votes. They passed the Tenure of Office Act that required the consent of the Senate for the removal of an office holder by the president. This was specifically done to protect Edwin Stanton, who was like a thorn in Johnson's side. Big-time abolitionist, big-time radical Republican. I mean, even Lincoln didn't like him. They also passed the Military Reconstruction Act that broke the former Confederate states no longer were states. They went back out, were kicked out, and basically the former Confederacy was divided into 5 military zones where they had to re-earn their way back into the Union. And if you're going to get jiggy with constitutional things, you remove Supreme Court jurisdiction. So they can't pass laws that are impeding the changes you're trying to make. Franklin Delano Roosevelt did the exact same thing when he was passing his New Deal legislation. Ready for the next slide? And basically, Johnson fell right into their trap by firing Edwin Stanton. He couldn't stand it anymore. Oh, this is B, the impeachment and trial of Johnson. So almost immediately, in reaction to Stanton's firing, they pass 11 articles of impeachment, which missed by only 1 vote. So Johnson got to stay in office, but guys, because he barely squeaked by the effects of the failure to impeach him, Johnson pretty much learned to sit back and shut up and let Congress take the lead. You ready? C, Republican rule in the South. Excuse me. You had new governments established in southern states. By June of 1868, Congress agreed that 7 states had met conditions for readmission. Indeed, all but Virginia, Mississippi, and Texas. Even though later on they threw out Georgia, because Georgia dismissed 25 black members and seated ex-Confederates in their stead for the state legislature. And the military governor forced them to reseat the thrown out members and ratify the 15th Amendment, which they did. Oh, and by the way, nationally, the 15th Amendment did pass, and that gave the newly freed men the right to vote. So an easy way to remember the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments is free people vote. Basically, the 13th Amendment gave them their freedom, the 14th Amendment made them citizens, and the 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote. Also, you had the Union Leagues formed, which was founded in Philadelphia in 1862 to promote support for the Union, and it enrolled blacks and sympathetic whites. And it was so successful in South Carolina that by 1867, they had enrolled almost every adult black male in the state. Ready for our next slide? Effects on the local level, Texas, Roman numeral 5. A reverse look. This basically is based on a book by Campbell, Rudolph Campbell, or Mike, Grassroots Reconstruction in Texas, where he said basically if you wanted to look, don't look at the national level down, instead look at the county level up. Because like here in Texas, we're mainly a rural state. So he compared the county governments in 6 states. Reverse look continued. And of course you had varied circumstances leading to varied outcomes. Like in Colorado, Harrison, and McLennan counties, they wanted to try to prevent as much change as possible. And so they really kind of stagnated. And Dallas, Jefferson, and Oasis, that was a little bit different. In Dallas, at first, they didn't work with the newly freed men, but then they figured out, hey, it's smarter to work with the newly freed men than against them. Jefferson County, they had an intermediary population of Germans that acted as a go-between, that advanced the kind of self-reconstruction they did there. Down in Oasis County, that's where Corpus Christi is, well, it didn't really have a high black population, so not much changed. The effect of the new look is basically just a different way of looking at it, providing some interesting insight. All right, you ready for the next slide? Overthrow of Reconstruction, Roman numeral 6. Well, first president after Johnson is U.S. Grant, and his administration is known as the most corrupt in American history. Now, the sad thing is that Ulysses S. Grant really wasn't that corrupt. He didn't make any money, but because he was a general, the people that had been underneath him, basically he would tell them, hey, you got to go achieve this goal, and that he trusted them to go out and do it. They were totally dishonorable. You had stuff like the Credit Mobilier scandal. That was a group that had been created basically to get money from the government, funding railroads that weren't built. I mean, they were paying congressmen bribes as large as their yearly salaries to make sure that legislation got passed that would get them more money. You had like Secretary of War Taney, who embezzled more than $1 million from the Veterans Bureau. And when that's found out, he resigns in shame. At the post office, if you wanted a job as a postman, you'd have to pay like your local leader to get you that job. He, of course, would keep a piece of that bribe, send the rest of it up the chain. It would go all the way up to the Postmaster General. Meanwhile, the Postmaster General, if a clock factory came to him, they'd offer him a huge bribe, and they'd say, hey, tell everybody that works at the post office that they got to buy one of these clocks. And so all the people would have to buy that clock, and that factory would make a lot of money. You also had the whiskey ring up in New York City that basically was a group that wouldn't collect tariffs or anything like that and sell goods. Also, they would basically sell contraband items, making a whole lot of money totally illegally. And these are government officials. In the election of 1872, well, the North's commitment to Reconstruction had begun to wane during the 1870s. You had a new party that came out called the Liberal Republicans. They wanted basically free trade, a stable currency, restoration of rights to the Confederates, pulling out the federal troops, because those federal troops cost money. The guy who was in charge of the Liberal Republicans was Horace Greeley. He was editor of the New York World. He was the guy who said, "Go west, young man." And he went on an exhausting campaign that ended only in his collapse. Ready for the next slide? Election of 1872 continued. What were the results of the election? Well, surprisingly, only 6 southern states voted for the Liberal Republicans, which of course left him completely devastated. And some people say that it contributed to a rise of racism in the North. Next slide. Well, but then shortly after that election, America gets into the Panic of 1873, which is the longest and most severe economic depression we had been in up to that time. In the midterm elections, people are starting to vote for Democrats, and the Republicans are losing ground. And guys, the scariest thing to people in power is the fear of losing that power. You ready for the next slide? D, a stolen election and a corrupt bargain. Guys, if you want to know if anything though was a stolen election was the election of 1896. Basically, the Republican candidate was James G. Blaine. Democratic candidate was Samuel J. Tilden. James G. Blaine was a senator from Maine. Tilden was a guy who had no legitimate child, except he recognized him. So the campaign letters, the chants during that was like, Blaine, James G. Blaine, Continental Wire from the state of Maine. And with Tilden they went, Ma, where's my pa? Running for the White House, ha ha ha. Well, everything was looking good for Blaine till the Mulligan letters were released. What were the Mulligan letters? Basically, they were letters that said some scandalous things about like Catholics and the Irish that were very derogatory. So the Republicans said, don't think we like you anymore, Blaine. So they got Rutherford B. Hayes to run against Tilden. And as the smoke is clearing from the national election, Tilden was coming out the victor. Now, there were disputed votes in Florida, Georgia, and one other state. So they said, we got to go down and do something. So the Republicans went down there, went to Southern Democrats, and said, hey guys, if you vote for Hayes instead of Tilden, we'll go ahead and we'll pull the troops out of the South. And of course, by pulling the troops out of the South, that would pretty much return home rule to the South. So Hayes was able to win through a compromise. And with the pulling out of the federal troops and the return of home rule to the South, basically limitations against the newly freed men slowly began to be on the increase. And that's why 1877 is known as the official end of Reconstruction. Next slide.